In this lesson, we'll be rendering our guts. Okay, so in our last lesson, we set up all of the compositing tags that we needed for our sky and for our zombie with the object buffer. And you want to make sure that you still have your plane set to, well, it doesn't really matter if it's set to not being able to be seen in the perspective view. I just think it's easier to work with, but just make sure that it is able to be rendered so that that bottom stoplight is gray and the background, the bottom stoplight is red, because we don't want the background to be rendered, okay? So now let's go ahead and put this in our, or start editing our render settings so we can put it in our render cube. So come up here to render, go to edit render settings. And the first thing we need to do is go to our output, make sure all of these settings are correct. The first one I noticed that we need to change is this, where it says current frame, switch that to all frames. And that's going to render your whole frame range. And then we need to come over here to save, make sure you check save on. And you want to have save checked on here. And we want to define where we want our RGB image to be saved to. We're going to be saving out 3 separate passes. We'll have our RGB, an alpha, and our object buffer, which is also an alpha, but it doesn't contain our shadow. So this is defining where the alpha and that object buffer would go. So let's go ahead and, the alpha and the RGB. So we need to go ahead and click this to define that. Okay, here we are, and we'll go into your project files and your reference files folder, and we need to make a new folder that we'll call Zombie Guts Crawl. And I'll go in that, and let's call this Zombie. It's short and sweet. Then you can go ahead and hit save. And now, while we're still here, you want to make sure you have alpha channel checked on. And I like checking on that separate alpha, so I'll check that as well. So I'm going to have my alpha that's rendered that contains my shadow, and I'll have my RGB. Up until this point, that's what I've set up so far. Now I need to go into multipass and check that on. And I need to check on the save option here. And then I need to tell this where I want this one to save to. Okay, so we're in the same place we were last time. We'll just double click to go into your reference files. We'll go into that Zombie Guts Crawl. And again, we'll just call this one Zombie. And it's going to add things to it for us. Or if you didn't want to call it Zombie, if that's too confusing, you could call it Object Buffer, because that's what's going to be coming out of this multipass. So go ahead and save that. And you don't want to check on multi-layer file unless you want to do a little bit of extra channel work in Nuke. So it's easier just to have the separate passes if you're not interested in messing with that. So this is all ready to go. You just want to make sure you have both of those checked on to save, and you've definitely got your alpha checked on, and you've got this multipass ready to go. Now, to really get the multipass to work, to get our object buffer, we need to add an object buffer to this multipass by clicking this multipass button and clicking object buffer, and that automatically is set to the group ID 1. And if we look at our compositing tag we have on our zombie, that object buffer is set to 1 as well, which is exactly what we want. If you go into your anti-aliasing tab here, you want this to be set to best. That's just going to give you obviously the best results. I don't really change anything here in the options section, but I do like to add an effect, which is ambient occlusion. So if you click effect and add ambient occlusion, really going to make things look nice for you. Now, there is a way that we can check to see how is this working, what does this look like before we actually set off our render. And that is by doing just a quick render in our picture viewer. So if we go into our our output tab, and I'll switch this back to just current frame for a moment, I can X out of this, and then I can hit Shift R to open up the picture viewer, and it'll start rendering 1 frame for me. That's why I set it back to current frame instead of all frames, because I don't want it to try to make a movie for me, which it would if I told it to do that. So if we come over here to layer, I can click single pass, and then I can look at my background. I can look at our alpha, and I can look at our object buffer. And all of those are doing exactly what we want. The alpha has this shadow in it, and it looks like it's giving, honestly, a little bit of maybe a cloud is kind of casting a shadow on this area back here, which is just because of the sky we used. If you didn't want to have this, you could turn off your clouds, and that would make that not happen. But I've tested it, and this still looks great in Nuke because this is so small. It honestly makes this zombie stand out a little bit more by darkening that area back there. So don't worry about that. If you don't want to have it, you would just want to tweak your sky. That's all that's happening there. Then we've got our object buffer that does not contain our shadow, and then obviously our RGB image shown there in the background. So we can go ahead and X out of this. We don't want this to finish calculating because we achieved what we wanted, so you can go ahead and stop that. And then we'll come up here to our render settings, go to your edit render settings, and we'll switch back from current frame to all frames. And then we need to save this before we're ready to render. So I'm going to save this as, just right there. And I'll just save this as your end file. So we've got 13 begin is what we were working on. So I'll just change this one to, we'll do 13 end. Go ahead and hit save. So we're rendering from 13 end. And now we're ready to add it to the render queue. So you'll come in here, you'll hit add to render queue. And it looks like I have something else in there. I can just select that and delete it. So we're only rendering this file here. And then this area here, you really need to pay attention to. This is going to make a huge difference on what comes out. You have to make sure that this multipass image is available to you. If you didn't save it, if you said, no, I don't want to save, or you didn't save as, that might not be available, and that's going to be bad news for you. So make sure that you click this browse right here, and that you're going into that zombie guts crawl if you look at the outcome. So that looks good. And that looks good as well. That's our object buffer. And you can also see where the log is going to go, which in my case is going to go in the same place that this other one is going to go, these other two images here. So I'll go ahead and make sure that this is checked on. If it's not checked, you want to make sure that that's checked. And then you'll come up here to jobs and hit start rendering. And that's going to start rendering out those frames for you. Now, I always say, you can check and double check a render and you might miss something. So it's always a good idea before you hit render and walk off and go do whatever you're going to do, to just kind of take a look at and at least make sure the first frame did what you wanted. Because sometimes even doing that picture viewer like we did, it'll show what's set up to render, but let's say for instance you didn't save it and this was grayed out, it wouldn't have rendered your alpha or your object buffer. So it's a good idea just to check on that kind of stuff. So I've got your reference files folder here where that's being rendered to. And if we go into your zombie guts crawl folder, once this first frame has rendered, we should get 3 separate passes. So get the first frame of 3 separate passes all at the same time when that first frame renders. So we'll give this a second to put that in there for us, and we'll make sure that everything is rendering as it should be. And sure enough, those popped up, and we've got our alpha, our object buffer acting as an alpha, and we've got our zombie. And you can see that because we named this object buffer, even if we hadn't, if we'd named it zombie again, it would have been zombie underscore object. So even if you name them all the same thing, it's going to give you indications based on what it knows it's rendering to help you differentiate that. So let's just really quickly double check it. I'm going to open this up in Photoshop. And that is our alpha. Perfect. I'm going to move this over here so I can get to these. And I'm going to open up our object buffer next. Perfect. That's what we want. And our RGB. Okay, so I clicked on all 3 of those. They're all there for us. So that's exactly what we want. And we can let the rest of that render finish up its job. And we'll come back in the next lesson and we'll start compositing in Nuke.